Miguel Ramirez had mastered the art of blending in. To anyone visiting his small plumbing business in the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, he was just another hardworking tradesman with calloused hands and a friendly smile. His weathered work boots and simple demeanor gave no hint that those same hands had once commanded elite special forces units in the deadliest corners of Afghanistan. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Even fewer would guess that this unassuming plumber had led some of the most dangerous covert operations in modern military history, missions that would never see the light of day. The morning sun beat down on the local farmers market as Miguel loaded his truck with fresh produce, a weekly ritual he had grown to love since leaving the military behind. The market was his sanctuary, a slice of normal life where he could forget the shadows of his past, the vibrant colors of fresh vegetables, the aroma of locally baked bread, and the cheerful chatter of vendors helped ground him in the present. Here he wasn't Staff Sergeant Ramirez, the decorated Special Forces operator. He was just Miguel, the local plumber who could fix any leak. That peaceful existence shattered on an otherwise ordinary Saturday morning. The first sign of trouble came when he noticed three men weaving through the market stalls, their presence as jarring as a wolf among sheep. They moved with an arrogance that set Miguel's combat-honed instincts on edge. Their designer clothes and gold chains seemed out of place among the modest market crowd, but it was their eyes that caught his attention, predatory, scanning the area with practiced precision. Miguel continued arranging tomatoes in his basket, his movements deliberate and unhurried, but his mind was already cataloging details. The leader, a tall man with a silver watch worth more than most cars in the parking lot, had a slight bulge. Under his leather jacket, concealed weapon, likely a compact pistol. His two companions flanked him like trained dogs, their stances suggesting they were also armed. Their clothes reeked of expensive cologne, a sharp contrast to the natural scents of fresh produce and herbs that usually filled the market air. The trio stopped at various stalls, but they weren't shopping. They were collecting protection money, Miguel realized, watching as they strong-armed an elderly woman selling handmade crafts. His jaw tightened as he observed their methodical shakedown of the market vendors, many of whom were immigrants just trying to make an honest living. The woman's hands trembled as she reached for her cash box, her eyes downcast and defeated. Miguel's hands stilled over the produce as the men approached his section of the market. He could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline, the heightened awareness that had kept him alive through countless operations. The skills he'd hoped to leave behind were rushing back like muscle memory, as natural as breathing. His fingers brushed against the rough wooden edge of the produce stand, mentally noting its position and stability. "Buenos dias, amigo," the leader called out, his voice carrying a false warmth that set Miguel's teeth on edge. "Nice selection you have here." The morning sun glinted off his gold rings as he gestured broadly at the display. Miguel straightened up slowly, meeting the man's gaze with a carefully neutral expression. "Can I help you with something?" The words came out measured and controlled, masking the tactical assessments running through his mind. The leader smirked, running his fingers over the perfectly ripe tomatoes. "Actually, yes, we're here to discuss business. You see, this market needs protection, and my boss, Mr. Ortiz, provides that protection. We've noticed you haven't been contributing your fair share." His accent was thick with arrogance, each word dripping with barely concealed menace. Miguel's mind flashed to the elderly vendor he'd seen earlier, the fear in her eyes as she handed over her hard-earned money. "I'm just here to buy groceries," he said evenly. "I run a plumbing business across town. This isn't my stall." A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, not from fear, but from the intensity of the Arizona sun beating down on them. The leader's Smirk widened as he picked up a tomato, squeezing it until the skin split, red juice running down his fingers. "Don't play dumb, Plumber. Everyone here pays. Nobody gets special treatment." The two other men moved to flank Miguel, their body language threatening. Other vendors began to back away, their faces etched with familiar fear, knowing what was coming. Miguel remained still, his breathing steady, years of combat experience telling him exactly where each man stood, calculating distances and angles with unconscious precision. "I don't want any trouble," Miguel said, his voice carrying a weight that made the leader pause for just a moment. It was the voice of a man who had seen real combat, who had made hard choices in impossible situations, who had led men through the valley of death and brought them back alive. The leader recovered quickly, stepping closer until Miguel could smell his expensive cologne, mixing with the scent of crushed tomato. "Trouble's already here, pendejo. You either pay up or we'll have to teach you how things work in our territory." Miguel watched as the man's hand drifted toward his concealed weapon. Time seemed to slow, just as it had in countless operations overseas. He could hear his old commander's voice in his head. Observe, orient, decide, act. The skills he'd learned in special forces hadn't just been about combat. They were about controlling situations, about staying alive when everything went sideways. The market had gone quiet, the usual bustling atmosphere replaced by a tense silence. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Miguel knew what would come next. He had seen it too many times before, violence erupting in peaceful places, innocent people caught in the crossfire. But this time was different. This time he wasn't on a mission in a foreign land. This was his home, his community, and these cartel thugs had just made a critical mistake. They had chosen the wrong Plumber to threaten. The leader's hand grasped the butt of his pistol, a polished chrome piece that caught the morning sunlight. The gesture was meant to intimidate, but to Miguel it revealed poor training. A properly concealed weapon shouldn't reflect light. Behind him, the other two men spread out, unconsciously creating a triangle formation. Their movements were practiced but sloppy, the kind of confidence that came from bullying civilians rather than real combat experience. "Last chance, Plumber," the leader sneered, his fingers drumming against his weapon. "Pay up or things get ugly." His gold rings flashed as he gestured to one of his men, who began clearing the immediate area of witnesses. Market-goers scattered like leaves in the wind, leaving a conspicuous empty space around Miguel's corner of the market. Miguel's mind raced through scenarios, each possibility unfolding like a tactical simulation. The leader was within arm's reach, too close for his own good. The second man had positioned himself near a stack of wooden crates, creating an unstable backstop. The third was trying to circle behind, but he'd have to step over a length of garden hose someone had left coiled on the ground. "Look," Miguel said, his voice still calm despite the mounting tension. "You're making a mistake." He kept his hands visible, resting them on the edge of the produce stand. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a gesture of submission. In reality, he was positioning himself for what would come next. The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the now quiet market. "The only mistake here is you, thinking you have a choice." He pulled his jacket back slightly, making sure Miguel got a good look at the chrome pistol. "We own this market. We own this neighborhood, and now you're going to learn to respect that." Miguel noticed more details. As his training kicked in fully, the leader's stance was wrong, too much weight on his back foot. The man trying to circle behind him was favoring his left leg slightly, suggesting an old injury. The one by the crates kept glancing toward the market entrance, betraying his nervousness. "You don't want to do this," Miguel warned, allowing a hint of steel to enter his voice. For a fraction of a second, he saw uncertainty flicker across the leader's face. It was the same look he'd seen countless times in Afghanistan, the moment when a bully realized they might have picked the wrong target. The leader recovered quickly, anger replacing his momentary doubt. "Enough talk," he snarled, reaching for his weapon. But Miguel was already moving. Years of special forces training had taught Miguel that the best fights were the ones you ended before they really began. His hand shot out, grabbing the leader's wrist in a joint lock before the man could clear his pistol. In the same fluid motion, Miguel stepped in close, using the man's own momentum to slam him face first into the produce stand. Tomatoes exploded on impact, their red pulp spraying across the leader's expensive jacket. The chrome pistol clattered to the ground, skittering away under a nearby table. The other two men reacted, but they were already too late. Miguel pivoted, maintaining his grip on the leader's wrist while kicking the garden hose toward the man, trying to circle behind him. The thug's feet tangled in the coiled hose, sending him sprawling. The third man by the crates reached for his own weapon, but Miguel was already in motion. Using the leader as a shield, Miguel pushed forward, ramming both men into the stack of wooden crates. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The carefully stacked boxes came crashing down, forcing the third man to dive away. Miguel released the leader's wrist, letting him crumple to the ground amid the chaos of scattered produce and splintered wood. The man who had tripped on the Jose was struggling to his feet, but Miguel was there in an instant. A precise strike to the solar plexus doubled him over, followed by an elbow to the base of the skull that sent him sprawling unconscious among the scattered vegetables. The third man had managed to draw his weapon, but his hands were shaking. Miguel could see the fear in his eyes. This wasn't going according to their script. They were used to intimidating shopkeepers and vendors, not facing someone who could fight back. "Drop it!" Miguel commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of battlefield authority. The man hesitated, looking from Miguel to his fallen companions. "Your choice," Miguel added, taking a step forward. "But trust me, you don't want to find out what happens next." The gun clattered to the ground. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. The leader was groaning on the ground, his expensive jacket stained with tomato juice and dirt. One man lay unconscious, and the third stood with his hands raised, all his previous bravado evaporated. Miguel surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency. Market-goers were peering from behind stalls, their faces a mixture of fear and amazement. The morning sun continued to beat down, indifferent to the violence that had erupted beneath it. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm began to wail. "Here's what's going to happen," Miguel said, addressing the only conscious thug. "You're going to take your friends and leave. Tell your boss that this market is off limits. If I see any of you here again, what happened today will seem like a picnic." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Understand?" The man nodded frantically. Already. Moving to help his leader to his feet, they gathered their unconscious companion, dragging him away as quickly as they could manage. Their retreat was hasty and undignified, a far cry from their confident entrance just minutes before. Miguel watched them go, noting their vehicle type and license plate out of habit. He knew this wasn't over. Men like that didn't take humiliation well, but he had sent a message, and more importantly, he had protected his community. The skills he'd learned in special forces might have left scars, but today they had served a purpose he could be proud of. He turned back to his scattered groceries, aware that everything had changed. His quiet life as just another plumber had been compromised, but some things were worth fighting for. As he began picking up the fallen produce, he could hear his old commander's voice. "The real test isn't winning the fight, it's choosing the right ones to fight in the first place." The market hummed back to life slowly, like a cautious animal emerging from hiding. Vendors began returning to their stalls, whispered conversations floating through the morning air. Miguel could feel their eyes on him as he methodically cleaned up the scattered produce, each glance carrying questions about who he really was. The peaceful anonymity he'd cultivated for years had shattered like the wooden crates still splintered across the ground. Maria, the elderly vendor who had been shaken down earlier, approached him with trembling steps. Her weathered hands clutched a small bag of fresh tamales. "Señor Miguel," she said softly, holding out the bag. "Por favor, take these. No charge." Her eyes held a mixture of gratitude and awe. Miguel straightened up, wiping tomato juice from his hands with a rag. "That's kind of you, Maria, but not necessary. I was just doing what anyone would do." Even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. Most people couldn't have done what he just did. "No, signor," she insisted, pressing the bag into his hands. "What you did. Nobody has ever stood up to them before. They've been terrorizing us for months." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But they'll be back. They always come back, and with more men." Miguel accepted the tamales, knowing rejection would only hurt her pride. She was right about one thing. The cartel wouldn't let this go. Men like that couldn't afford to look weak, especially not in territory they considered their own. His mind was already running through scenarios, preparing for the inevitable escalation. As if reading his thoughts, Jorge, the fruit vendor whose stall had taken the brunt of the fighting, stepped forward. "My cousin is a police officer," he offered, his voice low. "He says these men work for Victor Ortiz. They control everything west of the highway." He paused, glancing around nervously. "Ortiz is not someone who forgives easily." The name triggered something in Miguel's memory. Victor Ortiz, he'd heard whispers about him since moving to Phoenix. A mid-level cartel boss trying to expand his territory, known for brutal enforcement of his will. The kind of man who would send thugs to shake down market vendors, then escalate to something much worse when challenged. "Tell me more about Ortiz," Miguel said, keeping his voice casual as he helped Jorge salvage what produce they could. Other vendors drifted closer, forming a loose circle around them. "He owns that new nightclub on Martinez Street," another vendor contributed. "The fancy one with the blue lights, but that's just for show. Everyone knows his real business happens in the warehouse district." Miguel nodded, filing away the information. The warehouse district made sense. Plenty of places to hide illegal operations, minimal civilian traffic, easy access to transportation routes. It was the kind of setup he'd seen dozens of times during his military operations, just transplanted from foreign soil to American streets. "Last month," Jorge continued, "a restaurant owner refused to pay. 2 days later, his place burned down. Police said it was faulty wiring, but everyone knew." He shook his head sadly. "Now everyone pays, no questions asked." The circle of vendors murmured in agreement, each adding their own whispered story of Ortiz's cruelty. A beaten shopkeeper here, a vandalized store there, all carefully balanced to inspire fear while staying just under the radar of serious police intervention. It was a familiar pattern, one Miguel had seen played out in villages across Afghanistan, the steady erosion of a community's will to resist. "You should leave town for a while," Maria suggested, touching his arm gently. "Just until things cool down. My son has a place in Tucson." Miguel shook his head. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm not going anywhere." He'd spent too many years running from his past, trying to forget the skills that made him who he was. Maybe it was time to stop running. The vendors exchanged worried glances. They'd seen what happened to people who defied the cartel, and despite Miguel's impressive display of skill, they knew Ortiz's reputation for ruthless retaliation. "At least let us help," Jorge insisted. "We can warn you if we see them coming. Maybe keep watch." "No," Miguel cut him off firmly. "The best thing you can do is stay out of it. Go about your business normally. Don't change your routines. His voice took on the commanding tone he'd used with his Special Forces team. The more people involved, the more chances for something to go wrong. The vendors nodded reluctantly, recognizing the wisdom in his words, even if they didn't like them. One by one, they drifted back to their stalls, leaving Miguel alone with his thoughts and the remains of the morning's confrontation. As he loaded what was left of his groceries into his truck, Miguel's mind was already shifting into operational, a mode. He'd need to prep his house, set up surveillance, acquire some equipment he'd hoped never to need again. The skills were still there, lying dormant, but ready. The muscle memory of a life he'd tried to leave behind. Starting his truck, Miguel caught a glimpse of himself in the rearview mirror. The simple plumber was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused. The face looking back at him was one he hadn't seen in years, the face of a warrior preparing. For battle, the market was fully awake now. The normal bustle of Saturday morning commerce resumed. But underneath the ordinary scene, something had fundamentally changed. The cartel's grip on the community had been challenged, and blood would be spilled before this was over. Miguel pulled away from the market, his mind already planning his next moves. He had chosen this fight, or perhaps it had chosen him. Either way, he would see it through to the end. The plumber might work with wrenches and pipes, but the warrior worked with different tools entirely, and he remembered exactly how to use them. Miguel's modest house on the outskirts of Phoenix had always been deliberately unremarkable. A single-story building with fading paint and a small yard that blended seamlessly into the working-class neighborhood. But as he pulled into his driveway, his tactical mindset highlighted details he'd been trying to ignore: poor sight lines from the windows, multiple blind spots around the corners, limited escape routes. What had once felt like a peaceful home now looked like a tactical liability. Inside, he moved with purpose, shutting blinds and securing entries. The living room still smelled of coffee from breakfast, when his biggest concern had been fixing Mrs. Henderson's leaky faucet across town. Now, he pulled up the corner of the worn carpet, revealing a hidden trapdoor he'd installed when he first bought the place. Old habits died hard. The metal box inside contained everything he'd hoped never to need again: tactical gear, weapons, and communication equipment from his military days. His fingers traced the familiar shapes as memories flooded back. Midnight operations in remote villages, the weight of responsibility for his team's lives, the constant vigilance that became second nature. As he laid out the equipment on his kitchen table, his phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number: "You made a big mistake this morning. Boss wants to talk." Miguel smiled grimly. The cartel was predictable. They always started with threats before escalating to action. He didn't bother responding. Instead, he began methodically checking his gear. The Glock 19 he kept for home defense was well maintained, but he'd need more than that. From the metal box, he retrieved a suppressed MK-23, a specialized weapon from his Special Forces days that he'd never quite gotten around to surrendering. The familiar weight in his hands brought back muscle memories of countless training sessions. His phone buzzed again. Another message: "Last chance. Meet at Blue Light Club. 1 hour. Come alone, or we visit your customers instead." This got his attention. The threat to innocent people wasn't something he could ignore. They were escalating faster than he'd anticipated, moving straight to civilian targets. Miguel checked his watch. It was just past noon. The Blue Light Club wouldn't be open yet, making it a perfect location for an ambush. His mind raced through the implications. They were trying to control the situation, choose the battlefield. It was what he would have done in their position. He moved to his garage, where his work van sat parked next to his personal truck. The van was a treasure trove of plumbing tools, but more importantly, it contained detailed maps of the city's water and sewage systems. He'd memorized most of them during jobs, another habit from his military days, when knowing escape routes could mean the difference between life and death. The Blue Light Club sat in a renovated warehouse, part of Ortiz's attempt to legitimize his business. Miguel spread out the utility maps, his trained eye picking out details others might miss. The building's original water main connected to an older sewage system, with access points that wouldn't appear on modern city plans. It was the kind of detail that might prove useful. He changed into dark clothes, carefully concealing his weapons under a work jacket. In the bathroom mirror, he barely recognized himself. The transformation wasn't just physical, his entire demeanor had shifted. Gone was the friendly neighborhood plumber, replaced by the calculating warrior he'd once been. Another text arrived. 45 minutes. They were getting impatient. Good. Impatient people made mistakes. Miguel did one final equipment check. Extra. Magazines, tactical knife, small med kit, muscle memory from countless missions taking over. He'd always known this day might come, when his past life would collide with his present. He'd just hoped it would be later rather than sooner. As he prepared to leave, his eyes fell on a framed photo on his dresser. His old Special Forces team standing in front of a helicopter in Afghanistan, young faces grinning despite the dust and danger, bound together by something stronger than blood. He'd lost touch with most of them after leaving the service, each trying to find their own way back to normal life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years trying to distance himself from that life, and now here he was, gearing up for combat on American soil. But this time was different. This wasn't about following orders or serving some greater military objective. This was about protecting his community from predators who thought they could rule through fear. His phone buzzed one final time. 30 minutes. Clock's ticking. Miguel holstered his weapons and headed for the door. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his driveway as he climbed into his work van. To any neighbors watching, he might have been heading out for an emergency repair job. In a way he was, just not the kind that involved leaky pipes. As he drove toward the Blue Light Club, his mind settled into the familiar calm of pre-mission focus. The same state he'd entered before every operation in Afghanistan, when the noise of the world fell away and everything became clear and sharp. He knew it was almost certainly a trap. They would have men positioned throughout the building, probably more watching the approaches. But that was fine. Let them think they had the advantage. Let them believe that superior numbers and home territory would guarantee their victory. They didn't understand what they were dealing with, that the quiet plumber they'd threatened was a weapon himself, honed by years of combat and specialized training. Miguel checked his watch, 25 minutes until their deadline. Time to show the cartel why some people are better left alone. The Blue Light Club loomed ahead, its neon sign dark in the afternoon sun. Miguel parked his van a block away, using the side mirrors to observe the building's surroundings. 2 black SUVs were parked near the service entrance, professional-grade vehicles with tinted windows. A man in a suit leaned against one of them, pretending to smoke while scanning the street. Amateur surveillance, but still a sign they were taking him seriously. From his van's vantage point, Miguel counted 4 visible guards. The smoker, 2 near the main entrance trying to. Hard to look casual, and one on the roof poorly concealed behind an AC unit. There would be more inside, probably concentrated in the main club area where they'd expect him to enter. Classic ambush setup, but executed with more enthusiasm than skill. Miguel reached into his tool bag, retrieving what looked like a standard plumber's inspection camera. It was anything but standard. The device had been modified to include thermal imaging capabilities, a holdover from his Special Forces equipment. He'd kept it more out of habit than expectation of use, but now it would prove invaluable. Moving to the back of his van, Miguel pulled out a large tool case. Inside, nested among legitimate plumbing equipment, was his tactical gear. He strapped on a lightweight vest under his work jacket, Not full body armor, but enough to improve his odds. The familiar weight of the Mk-23 at his hip was reassuring as he gathered his supplies. The utility maps had shown him what he needed to know. The club's original infrastructure included maintenance tunnels that connected to the city's old water system. Most would be sealed now, but plumbers knew better than anyone. There was always a way in if you knew where to look. Miguel moved casually toward the adjacent building, his toolbox in hand. The guard on the roof tracked his movement, but Miguel's plumber's uniform did its job. He was invisible, just another worker in a service industry. He disappeared down the alley behind the club, where a rusty access panel was set into the ground. Using his modified camera, Miguel scanned through the metal panel. The thermal imaging showed no heat signatures below. The tunnel was clear. With practiced efficiency, he removed the panel's security bolts, using tools that looked perfectly normal in a plumber's hands. The hinges creaked slightly as he lifted it, revealing a narrow passage descending into darkness. Miguel checked his watch. 15 minutes until their deadline. Plenty of time to turn their ambush into his hunting ground. He descended into the tunnel, closing the panel behind him. The passage was tight but navigable, smelling of rust and stagnant water. His flashlight beam revealed pipes running along the walls, some still carrying water to the surrounding buildings. Moving silently through the tunnel, Miguel mentally mapped his position relative to the club above. The building's original blueprints, combined with his knowledge of plumbing systems, told him he was approaching a junction that would give him access to the club's basement. The cartel would be expecting him to walk through the front door. They wouldn't be watching the underfloor access points. A faint vibration from above signaled he was directly beneath the club. Music was playing, despite the club being closed. Cover noise for what they had planned. Miguel found the access panel he was looking for, hidden behind a cluster of pipes. The thermal camera showed 2 heat signatures in the room above, stationary. Guards posted in the basement. Miguel retrieved a small canister from his toolkit. The guards above had no idea that the ventilation system they were counting on for fresh air could be accessed from below. He released a measured dose of sleeping gas into the airflow, then waited, counting the seconds. Within minutes, the thermal signatures slumped and stilled. The access panel opened silently. He'd oiled the hinges during a routine maintenance call months ago, another habit from his military days of always preparing escape routes. The basement was dimly lit, cluttered with boxes and supplies. The 2 guards were slumped in their chairs, breathing steadily but completely unconscious. Miguel moved quickly, securing the guards with zip ties and checking their weapons. Cheap automatics with filed-off serial numbers. Poor trigger discipline, too, judging by how they'd been holding them. These weren't hardened criminals, just hired muscle trying to look tough. His phone vibrated. 5 minutes until their deadline. Above, he could hear movement, multiple sets of footsteps, voices giving orders. They were getting into position, preparing for his arrival through the front door. Miguel smiled grimly as he approached the basement stairs. They had no idea. They'd already lost the initiative. The basement door opened onto a service corridor behind the main club area. Miguel's thermal camera showed at least 8 heat signatures in the main room, positioned behind tables and the bar. Textbook ambush positions if he'd come in through the front. 2 more signatures moved on the upper level, probably carrying rifles for high ground advantage. Miguel checked his weapons one final time. This wasn't going to be like the market confrontation. These men were expecting trouble and wouldn't hesitate to use lethal force. But they were still thinking like thugs, not soldiers. They didn't understand the difference between setting up an ambush and controlling the battlefield. His phone buzzed one last time. "Time's up. Hope you made peace with whatever God you believe in." Miguel switched off his phone. The time for warnings was over. Now it was time to show these cartel soldiers the difference between intimidating civilians and facing a real operator. They thought they were the predators in this situation, but they were about to learn a harsh lesson about making assumptions. In the darkness of the service corridor, Miguel chambered a round. The sound was barely audible over the music, but to him it was as clear as a battle cry. The hunter was in position, and the trap was about to be sprung. Just not the way they planned it. The music in the club throbbed at low volume, covering the sound of Miguel's movements as he ghosted through the service corridor. The thermal camera showed him everything he needed to know. 12 men total, positioned exactly where he'd expect amateurs to place themselves. Their body language, visible through the heat signatures, screamed anxiety and inexperience. From his position behind the bar's storage room, Miguel could hear snippets of conversation. The men were getting restless, their confidence wavering as the minutes ticked by with no sign of their target. He recognized the voice of the leader from the market, trying to maintain control of his increasingly nervous team. "He's not coming," one voice said, tension evident in his tone. "Maybe we should call the boss." "Shut up!" the leader snapped. "He'll come. Nobody ignores a direct summons from Mr. Ortiz. Nobody." Miguel used their conversation as cover to move closer, staying in the shadows of the service area. The Club's layout was working to his advantage. Years of fixing pipes had given him intimate knowledge of the building's blind spots. He placed small charges at strategic points, nothing lethal, but enough to create chaos when needed. Through a gap in the storage shelves, he could see into the main club area. The men were positioned behind overturned tables in the main bar, weapons trained on the front entrance. 2 men on the upper level had set up with rifles, covering the main floor. They'd created a kill zone, expecting him to walk right into it. Miguel's hand brushed against his combat knife. The weight was familiar, comforting. In Afghanistan, his team had specialized in precisely this kind of operation, turning enemy ambushes into traps of their own. But these weren't hardened Taliban fighters. These were street thugs playing at being soldiers. "Check the perimeter again," the leader ordered. "He might try to be clever." 2 men broke away from the group, moving toward the back of the club. Miguel watched through the thermal camera as they approached his position. Their weapons were held carelessly, their attention focused on the obvious paths rather than the shadows. The first man passed within inches of where Miguel crouched, never noticing the predator in their midst. The second man wasn't so lucky. As he passed the storage room, Miguel struck. One hand clamped over the man's mouth while the other applied precise pressure to the carotid artery. The thug slumped silently, unconscious before he could make a sound. Miguel dragged him into the shadows, securing him with zip ties. "Marco, you see anything?" The first man called out, his voice echoing slightly in the empty club. Miguel pitched his voice to match the unconscious man's tone. "All clear here, nothing but boxes." The response seemed to satisfy the first man, who continued his patrol. Miguel allowed himself a grim smile. 1 down, 11 to go. He keyed the detonator for his first charge, holding it ready. "It's been 20 minutes, someone complained from the main floor. "Maybe he's not." The words cut off as the club's main power suddenly failed. The music died, plunging the room into darkness. Confusion erupted as the men shouted to each other, their discipline crumbling in the unexpected darkness. "Everyone shut up!" the leader shouted. "Get those backup lights on!" But Miguel was already moving. He triggered the first charge, sending a flashbang grenade into the center of the room. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, disorienting men who hadn't expected resistance from within their own stronghold. Through his thermal camera, Miguel watched the chaos unfold. The men were firing blindly now, their shots going wide as panic set in. The 2 riflemen on the upper level were trying to identify targets, but the darkness and confusion made it impossible. Miguel moved like a ghost through the darkness. Years of training taking over. The first two men fell to precise strikes, their weapons clattering to the ground before they could squeeze off a shot. A third turned at the sound, only to meet the butt of Miguel's pistol. The thermal camera showed the remaining men clustering together, their heat signatures bright with fear and adrenaline. "He's in here!" someone screamed, firing a burst that shattered bottles behind the bar. "He's in here with us!" The leader's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your positions! Don't let him—" Another flashbang cut him off, this one tossed onto the upper level. The rifleman fell back, temporarily blinded and deafened. Miguel was already moving up the stairs, taking advantage of their disorientation. 2 quick strikes, and the high ground was secured. Below, the remaining men were shooting at shadows, their formation completely broken. Miguel could hear the fear in their voices now, the dawning realization that they weren't the hunters here. They were the prey. "Call Ortiz!" the leader shouted. His earlier confidence shattered. "Tell him we need—" The rest of his sentence was lost as Miguel triggered his final charge. Smoke filled the main floor, turning the thermal camera's view into a confused blur of heat signatures. But Miguel didn't need it anymore. He could hear their coughing, their stumbling movements as they tried to find their way through the smoke. He had taken their ambush and turned it into his killing ground. Now it was time to end this, to send a message that would reach all the way to Ortiz himself. These men had come expecting to deal with a simple plumber. Instead, they had walked into the carefully laid trap of a Special Forces operative, and he was just getting started. Through the smoke and chaos, Miguel moved with lethal precision. The remaining cartel members had clustered into small groups, their training abandoned, in favor of basic survival instincts. The thermal camera showed their heat signatures huddled behind overturned tables and the bar, weapons pointed outward in a desperate attempt to cover all angles. "Where is he?" someone shouted, panic evident in their voice. The sound of coughing and cursing filled the club as the smoke continued to spread through the ventilation system. Miguel approached the nearest group. 3 men crouched behind an overturned table. Their weapons were pointed toward the club's entrance, still expecting the threat to come from outside. It was a fatal mistake. Moving silently through the smoke, Miguel reached the first man from behind. A precise strike to the base of the skull, and the thug dropped without a sound. The second man turned at the slight noise, but it was already too late. Miguel's combat knife flashed in the dim emergency lighting, the blade finding the pressure point in the man's shoulder. The weapon fell from nerveless fingers as Miguel guided him silently to the floor. The third man never even knew what hit him. "Rodriguez, Martinez, report." The leader's voice carried across the room, strain evident in his tone. When no response came, the fear in the room became almost palpable. Miguel retrieved a flashbang from his vest, calculating angles in his head. The remaining men had gathered near the bar, 5 heat signatures clustered together, plus the leader. Their body language showed their growing terror, weapons moving erratically as they tried to cover every approach. "Listen up," the leader shouted, trying to maintain control. "He's just one man. Spread out and—" The flashbang interrupted his command, detonating directly above their position. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, the light blinding even through the smoke. Miguel was moving before the echoes died away, transitioning from shadow to shadow with practiced ease. 2 more men fell before they could recover. Their senses, precise strikes leaving them unconscious on the floor. The remaining 3, including the leader, fired wildly into the smoke. Bullets shattered mirrors and glasses, adding to the chaos. But Miguel was already elsewhere, circling around behind the bar. "He's a ghost!" one of the men screamed, emptying his magazine into the shadows. "He's not human!" Miguel allowed, himself a grim smile. Fear was a weapon as effective as any blade or bullet, and these men were coming apart at the seams. Through the thermal camera, he watched as one of them broke ranks, making a run for the exit. The leader shouted after him, but panic had overcome training. The runner didn't make it 3 steps before Miguel emerged from the smoke. A quick combination. Elbow strike to the solar plexus, knee to the face as the man doubled over, and another threat was neutralized. The remaining 2 men spun toward the sound, but Miguel had already melted back into the shadows. "Show yourself!" the leader shouted, his voice cracking. "Fight like a man!" Miguel's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a technique he'd learned in Afghanistan. "You wanted to meet. We're meeting." A burst of gunfire answered him, the leader spraying bullets in a wide arc. His last remaining man was pressing himself against the bar, weapon shaking in his hands. The thermal camera showed his heart rate was dangerously elevated. He was close to complete panic. "Mr. Ortiz will kill you for this," the leader threatened, but the fear in his voice betrayed him. "He'll burn everything you love." Miguel moved silently behind the bar, using the cover of broken bottles and spilled liquor. The leader's threats were becoming more desperate, more unhinged. It was time to end this. He reached for another flashbang, but paused. No, this needed to be more personal. This needed to send a message. The last subordinate broke first. Throwing down his weapon, he made a dash for the exit. Miguel let him go, let him spread the word about what had happened here. The leader was alone. Now, his back pressed against the bar, weapons swinging wildly at every shadow. "It's just you and me now," Miguel said, his voice cold and precise, like it should have been from the start. The leader spun toward his voice, but Miguel was already in motion. He vaulted over the bar, his boot connecting with the man's chest. The leader stumbled backward, his shot going wide. Miguel closed the distance before he could recover, striking with mechanical precision. The fight was brief and brutal. The leader had some training, but it was street fighting compared to Miguel's military expertise. A flurry of strikes left the man disarmed and on his knees, blood streaming from his nose. "Please," the leader gasped, all pretense of toughness gone. "I was just following orders." Miguel grabbed him by the collar, lifting him to eye level. "Then here are your new orders. Tell Ortiz that his protection racket is over. Tell him what happened here, and tell him that if he sends anyone else to threaten innocent people, what happened today will seem like a warm-up." The leader nodded frantically, scrambling backward when Miguel released him. He stumbled toward the exit, leaving his weapon behind. Miguel surveyed the club through the clearing smoke. 8 unconscious bodies lay scattered across the floor, with 2 more men fled into the night to spread the story. The message had been sent. Now it was time to prepare for Ortiz's response. Because Miguel knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. In a dimly lit office across town, Victor Ortiz sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on its polished surface. The room reeked of expensive cigars and fear as his lieutenant Diego delivered the news about the Blue Light Club incident. The security footage played on a laptop before them, showing the systematic dismantling of his men through smoke and shadows. "Who is he?" Ortiz demanded, his voice deceptively calm as he watched another of his men fall to the invisible attacker. The footage was grainy, the smoke obscuring most of the action, but the efficiency of the assault was undeniable. "How does a simple plumber fight like this?" Diego shifted uncomfortably, his normally confident demeanor shaken by what he'd witnessed. "We've been digging, boss. Miguel Ramirez. He's not just any plumber. Special forces, decorated combat veteran, multiple tours in Afghanistan. The kind of operations that don't make it into official records." Ortiz leaned back in his leather chair, processing this information. The crystal tumbler of whiskey on his desk caught the light, casting amber shadows across the security footage. Still playing. And this military man, this operator, he chooses to fix pipes for a living? Seems he wanted a quiet life, Diego continued, pulling out a file. Moved here 3 years ago. Started his business from scratch. No trouble, no criminal record. Keeps to himself. Until today. Until today, Ortiz repeated softly, pausing the footage on a frame where their mystery plumber emerged briefly from the smoke. He took down 12 of our best men, made them look like children. 15, actually, Diego corrected, then immediately regretted speaking when Ortiz's eyes snapped to him. We found 3 more unconscious in the basement. Professional work. They never even knew he was there. Ortiz stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city. The sun was setting, painting Phoenix in shades of blood and gold. His empire had been built methodically, territory by territory, each block claimed through careful application of fear and violence. No one had dared challenge him so openly, so effectively. The men who ran, Ortiz said, still staring at the sunset. What did they say? Diego swallowed hard. He sent a message, said the protection racket ends now, said if we move against civilians again, what happened at the club would seem like a warm-up. A low chuckle escaped Ortiz's lips, surprising Diego. A warrior with a conscience. How quaint. He turned from the window, his face hardened. Call our friends at the police department. I want everything they have on him. Property records, business licenses, client lists. Everyone he's ever worked for, every building he's ever entered. Already done, Diego replied, grateful to have anticipated the order. But there's something else. The way he moved through the club, the way he accessed the building. He knew the layout, not just the floor plan, but the infrastructure. Ortiz raised an eyebrow. Explain. He used the old maintenance tunnels, paths that don't show up on modern blueprints. As a plumber, he'd have access to utility maps, building plans. He's been preparing for something like this, boss. The whole city's infrastructure could be his playground. The implications weren't lost on Ortiz. His entire operation depended on controlling territory, on knowing every corner of his domain. But this plumber, this warrior, had knowledge of the city that went deeper, quite literally. "Get me the Colombians," Ortiz ordered, returning to his desk. "I want their best. No more local muscle. We need professionals." Diego nodded, but hesitated before speaking. "Boss, the Colombians. They're expensive, and after what happened today, some of our regular customers might be less willing to pay for protection." Ortiz's hand shot out, grabbing Diego's collar and pulling him close. "Then make them willing. Double the rates. Anyone who hesitates, burn them out. This plumber wants to protect his community. Let's see how he handles protecting an entire neighborhood." Releasing Diego, Ortiz turned back to the security footage. He watched again as the smoke filled the club, as his men fell one by one to an enemy they couldn't see. It was beautiful, in its way, the kind of expertise that couldn't be bought, only earned through years of combat and sacrifice. "One more thing," Ortiz added as Diego reached the door. "Send someone to watch his house, not to engage, just observe. I want to know his patterns, his contacts. Everyone has a weakness. Find his..." After Diego left, Ortiz poured himself another whiskey. In the growing darkness of his office, he rewound the footage one more time. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was personal. This plumber, this special forces operator, hadn't just challenged his authority. He'd made Ortiz's men look weak. In his world, weakness was a death sentence. "You want to play hero?" Ortiz muttered to the shadowy figure on the screen. "Let's see how heroic you feel when the whole neighborhood burns." He reached for his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the number he needed. The Colombians would arrive within days, bringing with them a level of violence that would shock even a hardened combat veteran. But first, he needed to apply pressure, need to show this warrior that every action had consequences. Phoenix was his city, and he would burn it to the ground before letting some plumber take it from him. The sunset painted long shadows across Miguel's driveway as he finished unloading his van. The confrontation at the Blue Light Club had gone according to plan, but he knew it was just the opening move in a much larger game. His trained eye caught movement 2 houses down, a dark sedan with tinted windows. Ortiz's surveillance team, probably in place since he'd left the club. Inside his house, Miguel methodically cleaned his weapons while his laptop displayed security camera feeds from around the neighborhood. He'd installed the cameras months ago, another habit from his military days that had proven useful. The sedans. Occupants were trying to be discreet, but their occasional shift changes were obvious to someone who knew what to look for. His phone buzzed, a text from Jorge at the market. They came back, doubled the protection fees, those who couldn't pay. The message trailed off, but Miguel could fill in the blanks. Ortiz was responding exactly as expected, trying to reassert control through escalated violence. Miguel pulled up the city utility maps on his laptop, overlaying them with crime report data from the past 6 months. A pattern emerged. Ortiz's territory spread like a web across the western districts, centered around key transportation, routes and warehouses. The cartel boss was smart, keeping his most valuable operations hidden behind legitimate businesses. A knock at the door interrupted his analysis. Through the security camera, Miguel saw Maria from the market ringing, her hands nervously on his doorstep. He quickly secured his weapons before answering, maintaining his cover as just another tradesman. "Señor Miguel," Maria said, her voice trembling, "they burned Roberto's restaurant. His whole life savings gone in minutes. The police say it was electrical, but—" She wiped tears from her eyes. "Everyone knows it was them." Miguel ushered her inside, away from potential observers. "Tell me everything," he said, leading her to the kitchen. As she spoke, his mind catalogued details. Timing of the attack, number of perpetrators, police response time. Each piece of information helped complete the puzzle. "They're saying you provoked this," Maria continued, clutching the cup of coffee he'd given her. "Some people blame you for making things worse, but others—" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Others are starting to hope." For the first time, someone stood up to them. Miguel nodded grimly. He'd expected this. Civilian casualties were a classic terrorist tactic, designed to turn the population against any resistance. He'd seen it countless times overseas. Seen how it could break a community's will to fight. "Is there somewhere safe you can go?" he asked. "Family out of state, maybe?" Maria shook her head. "This is my home. I won't run." Her voice strengthened. "None of us will, but we need help, Señor Miguel. Real help, not just promises from police who look the other way." Before Miguel could respond, his phone buzzed. Again. This time it was a news alert. Fire at a bodega 3 blocks from the market. Then another alert. Assault reported at a family-owned garage in the same neighborhood. Ortiz was making his move, spreading terror methodically across the community. "Go home, Maria," Miguel said, his voice gentle but firm. "Stay inside tonight. Tell everyone you trust to do the same." After she left, Miguel returned to his laptop. The pattern of attacks wasn't random. Ortiz was targeting businesses in a specific sequence, working his way through the neighborhood like a cancer. But there was something else, something in the timing that nagged at Miguel's tactical instincts. He pulled up more data, cross-referencing police patrol routes with the attack locations. The pattern became clear. The cartel was exploiting gaps in police coverage, striking when response times would be slowest. Someone with access to police schedules was feeding them information. Miguel's phone buzzed one more time. A message from an unknown number. "Enjoying the show, Plumber? This is just the beginning." Every business that burns, every family that suffers, their blood is on your hands. Stand down now, or watch your precious community burn." Moving to his window, Miguel watched the surveillance sedan adjust its position slightly. They were, probably reporting his every move to Ortiz, watching for any sign of retaliation. They expected him to react emotionally, to rush out and try to stop the attacks. Instead, Miguel sat down at his workbench and began assembling equipment. His time in Special Forces had taught him the value of patience, of letting the enemy think. They had the initiative while preparing a counterstrike they wouldn't see coming. From a hidden compartment, he retrieved a small notebook filled with names and numbers, contacts from his military days who owed him favors, people with specific skills and resources that could prove useful. He'd hoped never to need them again, but war wasn't about hope. As night fell over Phoenix, the sounds of sirens echoed through the streets. Ortiz's men were busy spreading fear, teaching the community the cost of resistance, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed Miguel would play by their rules, fight on their terms. They had no idea what was coming, because while they were busy burning buildings and terrorizing civilians, Miguel was preparing for a different kind of war. One that wouldn't be fought in the streets or markets, but in the shadows and secrets that every criminal empire was built upon. The real battle was about to begin. The early morning hours found Miguel in the tunnels beneath Phoenix, moving silently through the maze of maintenance passages and utility corridors. His modified thermal camera revealed the infrastructure of the city, water mains, power lines, data cables, all flowing like veins beneath the streets. But he wasn't here to fix pipes tonight. His tactical vest carried different tools now: surveillance equipment, signal interceptors, and devices that would make any criminal organization nervous. The past 12 hours had been spent calling in favors, gathering intelligence, and preparing for a different kind of assault. Ortiz thought he was fighting a simple soldier, but Miguel's Special Forces training had taught him that information was often the deadliest weapon. 2 blocks from one of Ortiz's warehouses, Miguel paused at a junction. He quickly secured his weapons before answering, maintaining his cover as just another tradesman. "Señor Miguel," Maria said, her voice trembling, "they burned Roberto's restaurant. His whole life savings gone in minutes. The police say it was electrical, but—" She wiped tears from her eyes. "Everyone knows it was them." Miguel ushered her inside, away from potential observers. "Tell me everything," he said, leading her to the kitchen. As she spoke, his mind catalogued details. Timing of the attack, number of perpetrators, police response time. Each piece of information helped complete the puzzle. "They're saying you provoked this," Maria continued, clutching the cup of coffee he'd given her. "Some people blame you for making things worse, but others—" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Others are starting to hope." For the first time, someone stood up to them. Miguel nodded grimly. He'd expected this. Civilian casualties were a classic terrorist tactic, designed to turn the population against any resistance. He'd seen it countless times overseas, seen how it could break a community's will to fight. "Is there somewhere safe you can go?" he asked. "Family out of state, maybe?" Maria shook her head. "This is my home. I won't run." Her voice strengthened. "None of us will. But we need help, Señor Miguel. Real help, not just promises from police who look the other way." Before Miguel could respond, his phone buzzed. Again. This time it was a news alert. Fire at a bodega 3 blocks from the market. Then another alert. Assault reported at a family-owned garage in the same neighborhood. Ortiz was making his move, spreading terror methodically across the community. "Go home, Maria," Miguel said, his voice gentle but firm. "Stay inside tonight. Tell everyone you trust to do the same." After she left, Miguel returned to his laptop. The pattern of attacks wasn't random. Ortiz was targeting businesses in a specific sequence, working his way through the neighborhood like a cancer. But there was something else, something in the timing that nagged at Miguel's tactical instincts. He pulled up more data, cross-referencing police patrol routes with the attack locations. The pattern became clear. The cartel was exploiting gaps in police coverage, striking when response times would be slowest. Someone with access to police schedules was feeding them information. Miguel's phone buzzed one more time. A message from an unknown number. "Enjoying the show, Plumber? This is just the beginning. Every business that burns, every family that suffers, their blood is on your hands. Stand down now, or watch your precious community burn." Moving to his window, Miguel watched the surveillance sedan adjust its position slightly. They were probably reporting his every move to Ortiz, watching for any sign of retaliation. They expected him to react emotionally, to rush out and try to stop the attacks. Instead, Miguel sat down at his workbench and began assembling equipment. His time in Special Forces had taught him the value of patience, of letting the enemy think. They had the initiative while preparing a counterstrike they wouldn't see coming. From a hidden compartment, he retrieved a small notebook filled with names and numbers, contacts from his military days who owed him favors. People with specific skills and resources that could prove useful. He'd hoped never to need them again, but war wasn't about hope. As night fell over Phoenix, the sounds of sirens echoed through the streets. Ortiz's men were busy spreading fear, teaching the community the cost of resistance. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed Miguel would play by their rules, fight on their terms. They had no idea what was coming, because while they were busy burning buildings and terrorizing civilians, Miguel was preparing for a different kind of war. One that wouldn't be fought in the streets or markets, but in the shadows and secrets that every criminal empire was built upon. The real battle was about to begin. The early morning hours found Miguel in the tunnels beneath Phoenix, moving silently through the maze of maintenance passages and utility corridors. His modified thermal camera revealed the infrastructure of the city, water mains, power lines, data cables, all flowing like veins beneath the streets. But he wasn't here to fix pipes tonight. His tactical vest carried different tools now. Surveillance equipment, signal interceptors, and devices that would make any criminal organization nervous. The past 12 hours had been spent calling in favors, gathering intelligence, and preparing for a different kind of assault. Ortiz thought he was fighting a simple soldier, but Miguel's Special Forces training had taught him that information was often the deadliest weapon. 2 blocks from one of Ortiz's warehouses, Miguel paused at a junction. Above him, he could hear the rumble of trucks, late-night deliveries that somehow never appeared on any official manifest. He attached a small device to the main data line running into the building, its LED blinking silently as it began collecting. "Network traffic. Position 1 secured," he whispered into his encrypted radio. On the other end, a voice responded with 2 clicks. Acknowledgement from one of his old military contacts, now working in cybersecurity. They had spent the night setting up a surveillance net that would map every digital communication in Ortiz's territory. Moving deeper into the tunnel system, Miguel approached his next target. The thermal camera showed 3 heat signatures in the room above, guards watching over what appeared to be a server room. Ortiz's operation might deal in traditional violence, but they still relied on modern technology to coordinate their activities. A soft beep from his phone indicated another business had been hit. A family-owned bakery this time. Ortiz was keeping up the pressure, trying to break the community's spirit, but he didn't realize he was following a predictable pattern, one that Miguel was already using against him. "Package in position," came a whisper through his radio. Another former teammate signaling that surveillance equipment had been planted. Near one of Ortiz's nightclubs, they were building a complete picture of the cartel's operation, mapping every connection, every vulnerability. Miguel reached another junction, this one directly beneath the warehouse's main office. The thermal camera showed dozens of heat signatures moving above, more activity than a legitimate business should have at this hour. He retrieved a small device from his vest, attaching it to the building's power supply. When activated, it would create a surge that would fry every piece of electronic equipment in the building. "Motion at your 6, his radio crackled. Miguel pressed himself against the wall as footsteps echoed through the tunnel. 2 maintenance workers appeared, their flashlights sweeping the passage. But these weren't city employees. Their weapons bulged obviously beneath their coveralls. Miguel waited until they passed his position, then moved with practiced silence. 2 quick strikes, and both men were unconscious before they could raise an alarm. He zip-tied them securely, then keyed. His radio, package wrapped. Need cleanup in the south tunnel. Another double click acknowledged his request. Within minutes, the unconscious men would disappear into custody, their phones and equipment providing more intelligence about Ortiz's operation. Checking his watch, Miguel noted the time. In 3 hours, the morning shift would arrive at the warehouse above. By then, every piece of surveillance equipment needed to be in place. They were building a digital noose around Ortiz's empire, one that would tighten without him ever realizing it was there. His phone buzzed. Another message from Ortiz. 4 businesses tonight. Tomorrow will be worse. Ready to reconsider your position? Miguel didn't respond. Instead, he moved to his final position of the night, a junction box that connected multiple buildings in Ortiz's territory. From his vest, he removed what looked like a standard circuit breaker but contained sophisticated monitoring equipment. Once installed, it would track every phone call, every text message, every digital transaction in a 3-block radius. "Network is live," came the voice of his cyber contact, "beginning data collection." Above ground, sirens wailed as another business fell victim to Ortiz's campaign of terror. But Miguel remained focused on his task. The cartel boss thought he was fighting a war of intimidation, of brute force. He didn't understand that modern warfare was fought with information as much as violence. Miguel checked his thermal camera one last time, ensuring no heat signatures were approaching his position. The night's work was almost complete. By morning, every major hub in Ortiz's territory would be compromised, every communication monitored, every transaction tracked. "All teams, check in," he whispered into his radio. One by one, his former teammates confirmed their positions and successes. They had worked together seamlessly, just like in their military days. But this time, their battlefield was urban infrastructure rather than foreign terrain. As Miguel began his exit through the tunnel system, he allowed himself a grim smile. Ortiz was busy putting on a show of force, burning businesses and terrorizing civilians. But while the cartel boss played at being a warlord, Miguel had spent the night becoming something far more dangerous. He had become a ghost in the machine, a shadow in Ortiz's networks, watching, listening, and preparing for the real battle to come. Because, while Ortiz thought he was fighting a soldier, he was actually facing something much worse, a warrior who understood that modern wars were won through intelligence, not just force. The night's operation was complete. Now it was time to watch the data flow in and plan the next phase of this underground war. Dawn broke over Phoenix as Miguel sat in his makeshift command center, surrounded by monitors displaying streams of data flowing in from his newly placed surveillance network. The spare bedroom of his modest home had been transformed overnight, filled with equipment that would make most intelligence agencies envious. His military contacts had come through with everything he needed. "Look at this," came the voice of Sarah, his former team's intelligence specialist, now working remotely from a secure location. Money transfers from Ortiz's clubs. They're all being routed through a series of shell companies before ending up in accounts linked to 3 local police commanders. Miguel watched the data scroll across his screen. each transaction telling part of a larger story. The corruption ran deeper than he'd initially suspected. Ortiz hadn't just bought off a few cops, he'd systematically compromised entire sections of local law enforcement. That explains the response times, Miguel muttered, cross-referencing the police commander's jurisdictions with the locations of recent attacks. They're deliberately creating blind spots for Ortiz's operations. A notification flashed on one of the monitors, movement at the Blue Light Club. The thermal cameras they'd installed showed a group of men entering through the service entrance. These weren't local thugs. Their movements were too disciplined, too professional. Colombian mercenaries, Sarah confirmed, having run facial recognition on the surveillance footage. Ex-military, specialized in urban warfare. Ortiz is upgrading his muscle. Miguel studied their movements carefully. These men were different from the amateur enforcers he'd encountered before. They moved with purpose, checking corners and maintaining proper spacing, actual combat veterans who knew their trade. Track their phones, Miguel instructed. Within moments, Sarah had their communications under surveillance, the encrypted signals cracked by equipment that officially didn't exist. They're setting up a command center at the club, Sarah reported. Looks like they're planning something big, multiple teams, coordinated strikes. Miguel, these guys aren't here to run a protection racket. They're preparing for war. Before Miguel could respond, another alert caught his attention. Ortiz's personal vehicle was on the move, heading toward the warehouse district. The tracking device they'd planted on his car showed him taking an unusual route, avoiding main streets. He's meeting someone, Miguel realized, noting the pattern. Someone he doesn't want to be seen with. The surveillance net they'd created began feeding them more data. Phone calls from Ortiz's lieutenants suggested they were mobilizing forces across the city. Bank transfers showed large sums being moved quickly, preparing for something significant. Miguel, Sarah's voice carried a note of urgency. I'm seeing orders going out to all their crews. They're not just targeting businesses anymore. They're pulling addresses, family information. They're going after people's homes. A map appeared on the main screen, showing dozens of marked locations across Phoenix. Each represented a family connected to someone who had resisted the cartel's demands. Ortiz was escalating beyond simple intimidation. He was preparing to terrorize an entire community. He's trying to force me out, Miguel said, his voice hard. Make it personal. Make me watch as he tears apart everything these people have built. The radio crackled, another of his team reporting in from the field. Colombian team is prepping heavy weapons, military-grade stuff. Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon. Miguel stood, moving to the window. The surveillance sedan was still there, watching his house. But now he noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Unmarked vans parked at strategic corners, men loitering in places that offered good firing positions. They're setting up a kill zone, he observed, expecting me to react to their next move, trying to draw me out. Sarah's typing could be heard over the comlink as she processed more incoming data. Ortiz just received a large transfer from an offshore account. He's paying for something big. Wait. She paused. Miguel, I'm seeing communications with someone inside federal law enforcement. They're trying to build a case against you, paint you as a vigilante targeting legitimate businesses. Miguel nodded grimly. It was a smart play. Use the law against him while simultaneously preparing for violence. Ortiz was attacking on multiple fronts, using every resource at his disposal. What's our move? Sarah asked. The question hung in the air as Miguel considered their options. The monitors continued displaying the flow of information, money, transfers, communications, troop movements. Ortiz was mobilizing everything he had, preparing to crush any resistance with overwhelming force. He expected Miguel to fight back the same way he had at the club, to try to match force with force. But Miguel had learned different lessons in special forces. Sometimes the best way to fight wasn't to match your enemy's strength, but to turn it against them. "Keep monitoring," he ordered, moving to his equipment cache. "I want to know every move they make, every dollar they spend, every word they speak. Let them think they're the hunters." Because Miguel had seen the pattern emerging in their data. Ortiz's operation wasn't just criminal. It was connected to something bigger, something that reached into law enforcement, politics, and international finance. The cartel boss had created a web of corruption that touched every level of power in Phoenix. And like any web, it could be used to trap the spider that built it. Through his thermal optics, Miguel watched the Colombian mercenaries establish their positions around his neighborhood. They were good, setting up overlapping fields of fire, maintaining communications discipline, positioning snipers on adjacent rooftops. In the past 12 hours, they had transformed the quiet residential area into a sophisticated kill zone. "Latest intel coming in," Sarah's voice crackled through his encrypted comm. "Ortiz just had meetings with 3 precinct captains. Money's flowing, Miguel. They're clearing the area of all police presence for the next 24 hours. Miguel adjusted his position in the maintenance tunnel beneath his house. He'd spent years mapping these underground routes, preparing for a day he hoped would never come. Now they were his greatest advantage, allowing him to move unseen while Ortiz's men watched empty buildings. "What about the civilian evac?" he asked, checking his equipment one final time. The weight of his tactical vest was familiar, comforting in its way. "Done," Sarah confirmed. "Anonymous tips about gas leaks got most of the neighbors out. Those who knew to expect trouble were already gone. Streets are clear except for hostiles." Another voice joined the comm. Jackson, Miguel's former demolitions expert, now watching from a concealed position 2 blocks away. "Got eyes on their heavy weapons. These guys aren't messing around, boss. Military-grade hardware, enough firepower to level the whole block." Miguel nodded to himself. The Colombians were preparing for a siege, expecting him to hole up in his house and try to fight them off. It's what most men would do, defend their home, their territory. But Miguel had learned long ago that the obvious move was usually the wrong one. "Status on the package?" he asked, moving silently through the tunnel system. "In position," Sarah reported. "All the data we collected, every transaction, every corrupt cop, every connection to higher-level officials, it's been secured and distributed to multiple federal agencies and news outlets. Time-delayed release, just like you specified." Miguel checked his watch. The pieces were in place. Now it was just a matter of timing. "Movement at the club." Jackson's voice was tense. "Ortiz just arrived with his personal security. He's—" Wait. A pause. "Miguel, he's got hostages. Looks like some of the vendors from the market." Through his thermal camera, Miguel could see more vehicles arriving at his house. The Colombians were getting ready, their movements suggesting they were preparing for a final assault. They had probably expected him to be inside, not realizing he'd slipped away hours ago. "Maria's among them," Sarah confirmed, her voice tight. "They grabbed her this morning. Ortiz is sending a message, submit or watch them die." Miguel's jaw clenched. He'd known Ortiz would resort to this eventually. Men like him always did, using innocent lives as leverage when their shows of force failed to achieve the desired effect. "Timeline?" he asked, reaching a junction in the tunnels. Above him, he could hear the rumble of vehicles. More mercenaries. "Taking position. They're giving you 1 hour to surrender," Sarah reported. "After that, they start executing hostages. Then they level your house, probably take out half the block with it. Make an example." Miguel activated a small screen on his wrist, displaying the feeds from cameras they'd planted around the neighborhood. The Colombians had set up a textbook urban warfare scenario. Multiple firing positions, escape routes covered, high ground secured. They were preparing for a brutal fight. "Status on our backup?" he asked, moving toward his predetermined position. "Ready on your signal," Jackson confirmed. "But Miguel, even with everything we've set up, these odds are bad, really bad." Miguel allowed himself a grim smile. "The odds were bad in Kandahar too. Remember how that turned out?" A chuckle came through the comm. "Yeah, but we had air support in Kandahar. We've got something better this time," Miguel said, reaching his destination. "We've got the truth." He checked his equipment one final time. The next hour would determine everything, not just his survival, but the fate of an entire community. Ortiz thought he was preparing for a military confrontation, a test of force against force. He didn't understand that some battles were won with information rather than bullets. "All teams, check in," Miguel commanded, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once led men through the worst combat zones on Earth. One by one, his former teammates confirmed their positions. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy who had every tactical advantage. But they had something Ortiz and his mercenaries didn't, a plan that had been months in the making. "Remember," Miguel said, "timing is everything. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear or see, stick to the schedule." Above ground, the sun climbed higher over Phoenix. In less than an hour, the streets would erupt in violence. But the real battle, the one that would determine the future of the city, was already underway. Miguel checked his watch one last time. The countdown had begun. The first explosion shook the ground precisely 57 minutes into Ortiz's deadline. It wasn't Miguel's house that erupted in flames, as the Colombians had expected, but rather their own command vehicle. The blast sent their communications into chaos, disrupting the carefully planned assault before it could begin. "Network is down," Sarah confirmed, monitoring the digital chaos. "Their encrypted channels just went dark. They're switching to backup frequencies, and we've got those too." Miguel moved through the tunnels beneath the blue light club, listening to the confusion erupting above. The Colombians were professionals, but their plan had relied heavily on coordination. Without it, they were just well-armed men scattered across too much territory. "Second team, execute," Miguel commanded. On cue, explosions rocked 3 more strategic positions, not lethal blasts, but precisely calculated to destroy equipment and create confusion. The careful kill zone the mercenaries had established began to fragment. "They're moving the hostages," Jackson reported from his position, "loading them into an SUV. Looks like Ortiz is falling back to his secondary location." Exactly as predicted, Miguel had spent weeks studying Ortiz's patterns, learning how he reacted under pressure. The cartel boss was predictable in his own way, always keeping civilians close as shields, always having an escape route planned. "Maria's in the lead vehicle with Ortiz," Sarah added. 4 more hostages in the second SUV. They're heading toward the warehouse district. Miguel reached a junction in the tunnels, pausing to check his tablet. The screen showed multiple video feeds, traffic cameras, security systems, and their own planted surveillance. Ortiz's convoy was moving exactly where they wanted it to. "All units, phase 2, Miguel ordered. Across the neighborhood, his team began their carefully choreographed moves. Small explosions and bursts of gunfire erupted at strategic points, herding the Colombians into predetermined zones. "Federal channels are lighting up," Sarah reported. "The data package just went live. Every corrupt cop, every bribed official, every illegal transaction. It's all hitting the news and law enforcement simultaneously." Above ground, sirens began to wail. The carefully bought police protection that Ortiz had arranged was about to evaporate as officers found themselves under sudden federal scrutiny. But Miguel wasn't counting on law enforcement. This part of the plan had to be handled personally. "Status on the tunnel charges?" he asked, moving faster now. The maintenance passage he'd chosen ran directly beneath the route Ortiz would have to take to reach his safe house. Armed and ready, Jackson confirmed. Just like we planned, not to collapse the road, just make it impassable. They'll have to divert through the construction zone. Miguel allowed himself a grim smile. The construction site had been carefully chosen, an abandoned development project that provided the perfect backdrop for what was about to happen. Ortiz thought he was escaping to safety, but he was actually driving into a trap 3 months in the making. "Contact!" Sarah's voice was tense. "2 Colombian teams trying to flank your position. They're good, Miguel. They figured out you're in the tunnels." "Let them come," Miguel replied calmly. He'd prepared for this, rigged the tunnel system with sensors and choke points. Execute containment protocol. On cue, several maintenance doors slammed shut, their electronic locks engaging. The pursuing mercenaries found themselves trapped in segments of the tunnel, separated from each other and their target. "Ortiz is approaching the trigger point," Jackson reported. 10 seconds. Miguel braced himself against the tunnel wall. The explosion above was precisely calibrated, powerful enough to crater the road without causing structural damage to the surrounding buildings. Through his thermal camera, he watched as Ortiz's convoy screeched to a halt, faced with an impassable obstacle. "They're turning," Sarah confirmed, "taking the only route available." "Miguel, you were right. They're heading straight for the construction site." The plan was working perfectly, but Miguel knew better than to celebrate early. The most dangerous part was still to come. Ortiz was cornered now, and cornered animals were always the most desperate. "All units, maintain positions," he ordered, moving toward his final destination. "No matter what happens next, stick to the plan. We only get one shot at this." Through his earpiece, Miguel could hear the chaos unfolding above ground. The Colombians were trying to regroup, but their sophisticated assault had devolved into disconnected skirmishes. Federal agents were beginning to swarm into the area, responding to the evidence dumps that implicated half the city's power structure. But none of that mattered now. Miguel had one target, one objective. Everything else was just background noise. "He's entering the kill zone," Jackson reported. "It's now or never, boss." Miguel checked his weapons one final time. The weight of his tactical gear felt familiar, almost comforting. This was what he'd been trained for, the culmination of months of planning, years of experience, and a lifetime of service. "Remember," he said quietly, "no civilians get hurt, no matter what." Above him, he could hear the sound of vehicles approaching. Ortiz was about to discover that his escape route had led him exactly where Miguel wanted him. The final phase was about to begin. The construction site loomed ahead of Ortiz's convoy like a concrete maze, its half-finished structures creating a labyrinth of shadows and dead ends. Miguel watched through his thermal optics as the vehicles slowed, their drivers suddenly uncertain. The carefully laid trap was about to spring shut. "Convoy split," Sarah reported clinically. "Main vehicle with Ortiz and 3 hostages moving to the central structure. Second vehicle, with remaining hostages, diverted to the east lot. Colombian security teams trying to establish a perimeter, but they're scattered." Miguel moved silently through the skeletal building, his steps silent on the dusty concrete. Months of preparation had led to this moment. Every corner, every stairwell, every possible escape route had been mapped and prepared. This wasn't just a battlefield, it was his killing ground. "Federal response teams are 8 minutes out," Sarah continued. "Local police are in chaos. The evidence dumps have half the force investigating the other half. Nobody's coming to help Ortiz." Through the gaps in the unfinished walls, Miguel could see Ortiz's men positioning themselves. They were good, maintaining professional discipline even as their plans crumbled, but they were fighting blind, unaware that every move they made was being tracked and recorded. "Second team in position," Jackson whispered over the comm. ready to extract the hostages from the second vehicle. On your mark. Miguel reached his predetermined position, overlooking the central area where Ortiz's vehicle had stopped. Through his scope, he could see Maria and the other hostages being hustled into what the cartel boss probably thought was a defensible position. Ortiz himself stayed close to them, using their bodies as shields. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Ortiz's voice boomed through the construction site, amplified by the concrete walls. "Using the tunnels, herding us here? But you've miscalculated, Plumber. I still have the hostages. And if you don't show yourself in the next 5 minutes, I start killing them." Miguel keyed his radio. "Execute Phase 3. Across the construction site, carefully planted charges detonated simultaneously. Not explosives, but industrial. Smoke grenades, filling the area with thick white smoke. The Colombian mercenaries immediately began firing, their muzzle flashes visible through Miguel's thermal scope. "They're shooting blind," Sarah observed. "Burning through ammunition." "Wait, movement at your 3 o'clock. 2-man team trying to flank your position." Miguel was already moving, sliding through the shadows as the mercenaries passed below. Their training was good, but they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see in an environment designed to confuse and disorient them. "Hostage team, go!" Miguel commanded. In the chaos of smoke and gunfire, Jackson's team moved with surgical precision. The second vehicle's guards went down silently, and the hostages were quickly extracted through pre-planned routes. "Second group secured," Jackson confirmed. "Moving to fallback position Alpha." Now only Maria and 2 others remained with Ortiz. The cartel boss had retreated to what he thought was a defendable corner, surrounded by his best remaining men. Through the smoke, Miguel could see him shouting into a phone, desperately trying to call in reinforcements that wouldn't arrive. "Federal teams 5 minutes out," Sarah reported. "Miguel, whatever you're going to do, it needs to happen now." Miguel triggered the next phase of his plan. The construction site's emergency lighting system, specially modified for this moment, suddenly blazed to life. The harsh white lights, combined with the smoke, created a disorienting strobe effect that any combat veteran would recognize. The Colombian mercenaries' discipline began to crack. Their communications were filled with confusion and mounting panic as the psychological warfare took its toll. They were highly trained soldiers, but they were fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. "Enough!" Ortiz shouted, his voice edged with desperation. He grabbed Maria, pressing a pistol to her head. "Show yourself now, or she dies. No more games." Miguel keyed his radio one final time. "All units execute Omega Protocol." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every strobe light in the construction site went dark simultaneously. In the sudden blackness, modified flashbangs detonated at precise intervals, creating a devastating symphony of light and sound. Through his night vision, Miguel watched as the remaining mercenaries finally broke. Their training couldn't overcome. The sensory overload, the calculated psychological assault that had been crafted specifically for this moment. In the chaos, Miguel moved. His actions were precise, economical, the result of countless operations in environments just like this. The first 2 guards went down before they could react, their weapons clattering uselessly to the ground. Ortiz spun wildly, trying to track the threat, but Maria, who had been carefully briefed through intermediaries, dropped her weight exactly as planned. The cartel boss's shot went wide, and then Miguel was on him. The fight was brief and brutal. Ortiz had street fighting skills, but Miguel had been trained by the best military forces in the world. Within seconds, the cartel boss was disarmed and on his knees, blood streaming from his nose, staring up at the man he had underestimated so badly. "The hostages?" Miguel asked into his radio. "All secure," Jackson confirmed. "No casualties." In the distance, sirens wailed. The federal response teams were nearly there, arriving to find a crime boss gift-wrapped, along with enough evidence to dismantle his entire organization. Miguel looked down at Ortiz, who seemed to have aged years in the past few minutes. "You wanted to meet the real me," he said quietly. "Well, here I am." The lights came back on, revealing the full extent of Miguel's victory. The construction site had become a graveyard of Ortiz's ambitions, his carefully built criminal empire dismantled in a single, perfectly executed operation. The war was over. The plumber had won. The morning sun painted Phoenix in shades of gold. As Miguel stood in his usual spot at the farmer's market, selecting fresh tomatoes from Jorge's stand. 2 weeks had passed since the night at the construction site, and the city was still adjusting to the aftermath. The arrests had sent shockwaves through every level of power: corrupt police officers, politicians, business leaders who had enabled Ortiz's operation. "The FBI is still finding new connections," Jorge said quietly, bagging Miguel's selections. "Every day more people are being arrested. They say the evidence trail leads all the way to Mexico." Miguel nodded, watching the market bustle around them. The fear that had hung over the community was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism. Vendors who had been paying protection money were now testifying against their former tormentors, their courage growing with each new arrest. "And the Colombians?" Miguel asked, though he already knew the answer. His former teammates had been thorough in their after-action cleanup. "Most were arrested," Jorge replied. "A few escaped, but word is they've left the country. No one wants to be connected to what happened here." He paused, lowering his voice. "They're calling it the Phoenix Uprising in the newspapers. A whole community standing up to the cartels." Miguel allowed himself a small smile. The media had created their own narrative, a story of citizen resistance and criminal empire's downfall. They didn't know about the months of planning, the surveillance network that had mapped every criminal connection, the tactical precision that had turned a construction site into a perfect trap. Maria approached his stand, her step lighter than it had been in weeks. Like many of the vendors, she had testified before the federal grand jury, helping to build the case that would send Ortiz and his associates away for life. "Señor Miguel," she said warmly, pressing a bag of fresh tamales into his hands, "for everything you did, for all of us." Miguel accepted the gift gracefully. The community had pieced together parts of what happened. They knew he had been more than just a simple plumber, that his military training had played a role in their liberation. But they didn't need to know the full extent of the operation, the sophisticated intelligence gathering, the coordination with his former Special Forces teammates. His phone buzzed, a message from Sarah. The surveillance network they'd established was being handed over to federal authorities, its data providing a roadmap to dismantle similar operations across the country. His former team had already moved on to other missions, other cities, where their unique skills were needed. "Will they come back?" a young vendor asked, voicing the fear that still lingered in some corners. "The cartels, I mean. Will they try to take over again?" Miguel met the young man's eyes. "Not here," he said firmly. "This community has shown what happens when people stand together. Sometimes all it takes is one person to stand up, to show others that resistance is possible." As if to emphasize his point, a police car rolled past the market. But unlike before, its presence brought comfort rather than anxiety. The corrupted officers had been replaced, and the new ones were working to rebuild trust with the community they served. Miguel finished his shopping and loaded his truck, the routine familiar and comforting. His tools were back to fixing pipes rather than planning operations, his tactical gear stored away but not forgotten. The skills that had made him a deadly operative now served a different purpose, protecting rather than destroying. In his rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of his reflection. The hardened warrior was still there, just beneath the surface, of the friendly plumber. But now both sides of his nature were in balance, each serving its purpose in maintaining the peace he had helped create. His phone buzzed again. A regular customer with a leaky faucet. Miguel smiled as he started his truck. There would always be battles to fight, some with weapons and tactics, others with wrenches and pipe fittings. The key was knowing which tool to use and when to use it. As he drove through the streets of his neighborhood, Miguel noticed small changes that filled him with quiet pride. Businesses were reopening, families were out walking without fear, and the community was growing stronger. They had faced down one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the region and emerged victorious. The construction site where the final battle had taken place was being renovated, transformed into a community center. It seemed fitting, a place of violence becoming a symbol of renewal. The scars of the conflict would fade, but the lesson would remain. Never underestimate the power of one person willing to stand up against injustice. Miguel pulled up to his customer's house, gathering his plumbing tools. The weight of the toolbox in his hands felt right, honest. He had been many things in his life, a soldier, an operative, a warrior, but perhaps being a simple plumber, protecting his community in his own way, was the most important role of all. The war was over, but the work of maintaining peace continued. And Miguel would be there, ready to fix whatever needed fixing, whether it was broken pipes or broken systems. After all, that's what he did best. He fixed things, one problem at a time. Some battles were fought with guns and tactics, others with courage and conviction, but the greatest victories were the ones that brought peace, that allowed communities to thrive without fear. And as Miguel knocked on his customer's door, tool belt ready, he knew he had found his true calling, a guardian of that peace, hiding in plain sight as just another neighborhood plumber. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.